We ourselves, the thing that thinks, the thing that makes us human is story. All of the things that we know that we are and that we present to other people are stories.
Welcome to Story Power, a new bi-monthly podcast where my guests and I geek out about the stories we're passionate about in all different genres, styles, and formats, and we'll give a few recommendations to you, our listeners. Beware, possible spoilers ahead. My name is Lucinda Sage-Midgorden, and I started this podcast during the COVID-19 pandemic. As I watched the reaction of my social media circle, I noticed that many people turned to stories for comfort and help in making sense of the craziness going on around them. And as all good stories do, the world got even crazier. But as Neil Gaiman says, fairy tales are more than true, not because they tell us that dragons exist, but because they tell us that dragons can be beaten. Since I believe that stories have the power to show us the way and give us courage to keep going, I wanted to see if that was true for my guests as well. You're listening to episode number 4. Today, my guest is Randy Murray. We met in college, and at one point, we played husband and wife in the play My Three Angels. Do you remember that, Randy?
I do. That was my first play at Graceland.
Really?
Oh yeah, that was. It was, and I'll have to look and check, but I believe it was the fall of 1978, and I was there to study biology and chemistry with the intention of going to med school. But I fell in with a bad crowd there, a little theater shop, and ended up changing all my plans. Along with not quite being able to handle sophomore year of calculus and organic chemistry too. That kind of worked itself out.
I admire people who can do that because my brain just does not work like that.
Apparently mine doesn't either.
Well, I'm glad that you stayed with theater. And I mean, I suppose you would have been a fabulous doctor, but...
Well, as I went through my working life, I could always say on my worst day, at least I didn't kill anyone.
That's true.
So if I had become a doctor, I may not have been able to say that. So all for the best.
Yes. So we tried this once before, and unfortunately, we were having a terrible time. The internet connection was bad. So I want you to tell again about how you got into stories. What was it that drew you to stories?
Sure. Well, I grew up out on the prairie in southern Illinois. I was the 5th generation on the farm, and actually grew up living in my great-grandfather's house.
Oh.
And it was pretty remote. There wasn't anybody around. My grandparents' house was about a quarter of a mile away, and there was no one closer, and pretty much as far as you could see, it was just prairie. So didn't have a lot of other kids my age to play with on a daily basis. And so I was left to kind of find what I could do to entertain myself and grow. And story was, listening to stories, picking up and trying to learn to read, which I think I mostly did before. I think it was in first grade that they introduced reading. And I think I was pretty much off the ground by then, but it always fascinated me, the world of books and the world of story. One of the first things that happened, and I don't know exactly how, but back when I was young, they used to have a thing in schools called a library, where they actually stored physical books. And I would wander around and find things. And you may laugh, but even a few years ago, when my girls were in high school, you wander in and there was nothing on the shelves. I mean, It was a media center. It wasn't a library anymore. But we had, even in a small rural school, had a beautiful little library. And I came across some books on Greek mythology. And I was spellbound, just absolutely gobsmacked that, and these stories completely mesmerized me and just kind of launched me off in the direction. Another thing that happened, I am so old that I have been a Star Trek fan since it was originally broadcast on television. But I was a little on the inside, and my parents weren't interested. So I only watched a couple of episodes when it was originally broadcast.
Oh,
but
yeah.
immediately thereafter, a science fiction writer by the name of James Blish, Blish, did novelizations of each episode. And they
Oh,
produced a whole series of books, usually with 6 or 7 of the episodes. And that's how I got to learn to Star Trek. It's not
yes.
by seeing it, but
Yes.
by reading it. And so
Well,
before I ever got to see it, I knew every episode inside and out and knew it in a
yes.
different way than if I had just seen it.
Seen it because I'm older than you are. And I did watch it. I think I was approaching high school when it started, or maybe I was in high school. And I got to see every episode. My brother and I loved it. And my mom and dad even watched it with us when they weren't doing church. Yeah, I would love to read those novelizations because I've read a few novelizations of some of the Next Generation
Mm-hmm.
episodes or movies, or maybe they were like offshoots, and they're wonderful.
Yeah, I think you would really enjoy these because they're all based upon the scripts, but they're fleshed out in ways that are necessary because
Yes.
you can't rely on things you
Yeah.
see or special effects. It all has to be in words. And Blish is a wonderful writer and has a great reputation of his own. One of the famous series of stories he wrote were called Cities in Flight. And I think they've been published together as a single novel and
Wow.
are well worth reading. That was all part of it. I was completely hungry for both reading and for, the components, the story,
Yes.
and trying to figure out how it all worked.
I started off with story and I've told this story before, but with my father watching movies and television shows and him asking, he used the Socratic method, even though he didn't finish high school himself and he had dyslexia. But he would ask question after question about what I thought about the story. And then, over the years, I learned how to analyze stories, what the plot, I didn't even really know the formal plot outline. But
Mm-hmm.
I knew instinctively that you had to introduce the characters and then they went through a lot of problems before they got to the climax and the resolution. And so I learned that from him, but then I realized that watching the movie first and then reading the book later, or watching the TV show and then reading the book later, did just that. It fleshed out the things that they had to leave out because they only had a limited time to tell the story. And mostly it's just dialogue and action. And you have to learn what is going on with the characters by watching their body language and their facial expression and what they do and say. I like that you had those two connecting things too. I think that's interesting that you and I both did that connection with the story and the book.
I think that's a common experience, especially in the modern era where we have that. The other things that in an earlier era, the generation before us would have done the same thing with radio. There was a lot of radio drama that preceded everything that we see on television. They used to call it the theater of the mind.
Yes. Yes. Actually, when I was teaching English, after I didn't get to teach theater anymore, I used that Orson Welles, was it War of the Worlds? And they were fascinated by that they didn't know anything about how people used to gather around the radio and listen. But they couldn't understand how come people didn't realize it was a radio show and not real news. Because to them it was obvious that it wasn't real news. That was fascinating to watch.
Well, I think that's a good question for today. You can watch the news, and then you have to ask yourself, is that real or not?
Yes.
And depending on what channel you have it on, that may be different. And you mentioned Orson Welles and War of the Worlds. This, of course, was after the time that Wells was established as a revolutionary theater director.
Right.
And he had gotten his start in the Federal Theater Project, which is a particular obsession of mine, and all of the wonderful things that were done in the, I believe it was 3 years that the Federal Theater Project existed.
We may have to go to that again after this COVID-19 because my friend Dave Dahl and a lot of his friends are out of work because all the theaters had to close down.
Yeah. And and just for, a future discussion, one of the things that I've tinkered around with for years is a recreation of the Federal Theater Project, unfortunately without the federal funding, called the Common Theater Project, which would allow for, I don't know whether in the software world, there's something called open source software.
Yes.
Which means that hobbyists can get together and they can work on a tool, a software tool, and then they just put it out there and it's free to use. Well, I envision a network of community theaters staffed by people with real theater training and understanding and having access to an open source theater data, a play and material database from which they could pull material and use it for free as long as they're not making money off of it. So that's another thing to talk about.
Yes, that's great. Well, my friend Dave Dahl would love that. Of course, a lot of performers are doing things online now, but he has a bunch of his professional theater people and some of the students that he and I work with here in Arizona and just regular people who work in community theater. They get together and he loves Shakespeare and has studied Shakespeare quite a bit. And so they are reading. I think the next one they're doing is Love Labor's Lost. Yeah, so he and I met doing he was helping me with Measure for Measure. Then I helped him with Twelfth Night. And so now he's doing a bunch of online and it's like a table read. But I love that people are just staying connected and staying creative, being creative.
We've had pandemics before, just not in our lifetime.
Yeah.
But now we have the ability to do things like you and I are doing right now, is to actually connect and be connected. Something to look for online is Patrick Stewart, who, going back to Star Trek, reading and delivering one Shakespeare sonnet a day.
I think one of Dave's friends is doing that with him. That is fascinating. I love that.
Yeah, you'll have to connect me up with your friends there because I'd love to talk to them because right now I'm in the initial stage of evangelism, where we talk about things and try to give it shape. And the goal is to have little theaters everywhere, creating new plays and new material and performing them and feeding that into this open source database that can be used and played anywhere. My goal with this is to kind of, I love professional theater. I love nothing more than to go to Broadway and to go see, the latest terrific shows or, to see your community theater do, a well-known musical or other thing. But what I really long for is that small, really connected theater in the community doing material and work for that community and speaking to them about things that are important to them and having what, like the ancient Greeks did, that moment of catharsis. We're all here together and we all see and understand this in the same way, things that we don't have today. So
what I was going to say was we just started a theater club.
Excellent.
Yeah. Actually, we were in the middle of the process when everything shut down. So our paperwork isn't quite finished yet. Next fall, we'll finish it up. But that would be a really great thing for our college to do, maybe. Unfortunately, we're only a community college, so we only have the students for 2 years. But in the past, this is my 11th year teaching there. I have had students who have written their own acting scenes, or they've, when I teach theater workshop, which is the performance class, they've written their own plays. So Dave would love to encourage that kind of thing.
Yeah, I'd love to. You can also point him or your listeners to commontheaterproject.com. And it's spelled with either ER or RE on theater.
Okay.
All will work.
All right.
But yeah, I think that there's this, and to bring things back around, the reason why this fascinates me is because it's back to story. It's about telling stories. It's about acting stories. It's about, those key experiences, that don't take $10 million to mount the production. It takes a couple of logs and a willingness to stand up front and to say, once upon a time.
When we did Measure for Measure, we did it on the library steps outside. Fortunately, in Arizona, it's warm enough in late April to do it outside, and hardly ever rainy then. When we did 12th Night, when Dave directed 12th Night, we did it in the Library Commons because he did it in December. So the Library Commons is this big hallway with, chairs and tables and things for kids to just hang out and play games or connect on Wi-Fi. We didn't have any special lighting. We only had but it's just like a wall. A partition, thank you. And one of our students was an artist, and so she painted a backdrop, and we just had a couple of things on the stage that the students would use, and we've fixed a backstage area in a carpeted area, and people, could walk through while we were doing our play, but it was really fun. And for the first time, the president of the college came to see one of the plays that I invited him to. So that was fantastic.
It sounds wonderful. And see, that's the kind of the core that I would love to see more of. I mean, if you go across the pond to London and you seek out the recreated Globe Theater, and you go up and you sit in one of the boxes, and you look and you see, and after studying Shakespeare for years, after dragging out, you probably still have your copy of the Riverside Shakespeare.
Yes, I do.
That we all lugged around, and mine is annotated and flags everywhere.
Yeah.
And then you really see and understand for the first time and say, oh, they were right there. And their costumes were pretty much the clothes they ordinarily wore.
Yep.
And the props they might have would be, do we need a sword? Yep, here's a sword. You need a cup? Yep, here's a cup. Everything else, nothing.
Right.
And everything is done through the acting and the telling. And it was thrilling at the time, and it still is, as you've demonstrated. Yeah. You don't need much. Now, I still love the spectacle and extravaganzas. Don't get me wrong, but there's something tremendously exciting about, just letting the words and the actors get on with it.
And the interesting thing about this, that Dave cut 12th Night and he added modern Christmas carols to it. And even some of the actors added some modern language in their lines occasionally. And we do not know how this happened, but someone from Pennsylvania, from this professional theater company, came to see the show. And they asked Dave if he would direct his version of 12th Night for them in 2021. And it was like,
excellent.
It was like, what? How did that happen? That was weird. So, but he has a network, of course, since he's been working for 25 years or 26 years in the professional theater. And he's one of those people that travels around. So somehow someone that he knew about this play that he was directing for the college and told somebody, I guess. I don't know. It was so interesting.
That's part of the power of live theater is things happen.
Yeah.
People come to see it and things happen. I mean, I love movies. I have a deep and abiding love for all things in the cinema, but it's the same every time.
Mm-hmm.
That's comforting to some people, but it's the same every time.
Yeah.
You can go to the theater every night of the week and see the same thing, and it is never the same.
You're right.
Uh,
The
and
performance will be different, just a
and the
little bit.
audience is different, and the energy is
Yes.
different, and all of
Right.
those things make it. And it's shocking to people who have never been to a professionally produced play. They may have seen their kids do something in grade school or high school or the local community theater, which can be really terrific. But the second you walk into a professional play, either on Broadway or with a touring company, and you suddenly realize, oh my God, how are they doing this?
I know.
It's it's at an entirely different level. I mean, we were in January, probably at the last moment possible. We were in New York, and we saw a couple of things. And one of the things we saw was Hadestown, which
Oh,
was the winner of all the Tonys in
oh,
the previous year, and it had all of the original cast, and it was absolutely stunning. And I after I watched that, I turned to Diane and said, "How can anyone else ever do this?"
I
Because
know.
it was so perfectly performed by the original cast, and a lot of it written for them. And then after thinking about it, saying, "Well, of course people will be able to do this because they will do it in a different way
Yeah, and that's the
and with
beauty.
different performances."
Well, and that's the beauty of all stories. When I read a book, I may get different things out of it than you get out of it or anybody
Yeah,
else gets out of it. But and that's the beauty of acting too that Dave and I try to teach the students is you don't have to do it the way it was done previously. And he's really good at helping them find their emotional connections to the characters. So that's the thing that story is to me. It's emotions. It's not so much intellectual. Yes, there is an intellectual component to it, but the stories that I love are the ones that touch my emotions.
yeah, absolutely. And one of the things I think that when you get into the study of story, and I'll have a couple of books to recommend before we're done with all of this. One of the things that we find out is the more we learn about the human brain, the mind, and
Mhm.
how it works,
Mhm.
the more we realize that we are not recording equipment. We are not
Right.
observing and perfectly storing all of the information that our eyes see and our ears hear and all of our other senses. But we're not recording it so that you can't
Right.
reach back and play back let's do the instant replay. You can't do that. Why is that? Because that isn't the way our minds work. It's not storing. So what we discover is our memories are stories about what happened. They
Hmm.
aren't the actual thing that happened.
Right.
They are stories. And even as we ourselves tell other people about something we witness, we change it in the telling. And in a lot of us, it changes how we remember it. So if you ask, legal scholars and lawyers about the reliability of person witness, they say it's crap, it's horrible. It doesn't work because, and even people who claim to have photographic memories, when
Hmm.
tested, it's discovered no, they don't. But they have ways of telling themselves stories that reinforce that over time. So
Right.
our very being, and I think this is what really gets it for me. We ourselves, the thing that thinks, the thing that makes us human, is story. All of the things that we know that we are and that we present to other people are stories. They're not the truth, meaning they are not the precise facts and only the facts. They are stories that we have heard and stories we have told and stories we've lived. And
Yes.
that to me is really thrilling to think about. And I take that a step further. And this, when I was working on my Master of Fine Arts in Playwriting,
Hmm.
and was, very deep in the bowels of the great library and, reading endless plays that had not been produced in hundreds of years, but, to really get an idea of how theater works and where it comes from. One of the things that I have come to believe, and I'm not a scientist, so I don't have to produce any evidence for this, is that theater is what happens when people come together to form communities. It starts with storytelling. I went out hunting for our dinner, and this is what I saw, and this is what I did. And that becomes retold. It becomes bigger. You bring others up to act out the various parts that are seen, and before you know it, you have theater. And theater are stories that communities tell about themselves. So theaters are stories writ large. And I think they are a natural output of the community, and they're an unavoidable side effect of people living together.
Yeah.
That you develop storytelling and theater, and that becomes more sophisticated over time, and everything else, including television, movies, and all of that, are simply sections of that greater story that we have in the theater.
Yeah, I mean, storytelling is one of the oldest art forms that humans have. So,
I go even a step. Yeah, I go a step further than that in saying our ability to think and our consciousness is tied in with story.
Oh, yeah.
The stories we tell ourselves are the part of us that is trying to explain the world to ourselves. And as that develops, that we become something that recognizes itself in a mirror. And then we have a story to tell about that.
Yes.
So I think that stories are, it's not something we can live without. I mean, that's not even something that you can say. It's something that is part of what makes us human. And when you take that away, what do you have? And it's something we wouldn't recognize as human. I've had people say to me before, "Oh, I don't read fiction because they are lies." And, initially, the first time I heard someone say that, I was taken aback and saying, that is a very weird thing to say, that they don't read fiction because fiction is a lie. And from my perspective, really well told, really well written stories are sometimes the path to the truth. Exactly. They are the way that we find the truth.
Yes.
And that they are not in any way or shape or form a lie or understood to be an untruth. They are part of how we communicate. And I feel like I have greater access to different periods in history by reading really well-written stories about that period or stories written during that period.
Yes.
And it gives me more insight. And even if you go all the way back and we find some of the stuff that is transferred to us from from as far back as we can go, when you read Gilgamesh, when you read the Iliad and the Odyssey, and you realize these people have strange names and they live in strange places, but they are dealing with the same things that we're dealing with. And they are thinking about things in the same way we think about it. And more importantly, they're feeling the same things that we felt. And we're talking about things that are thousands of years old. So I think that story is a core of that. And today, you look at today's market and you've got competing stories of things that claim to be the truth. Well, here are all the facts of the things that happen. Well, don't believe your lying eyes. Here's what I say happens. And you've got that. And I think it's very difficult for some people to be able to separate out, well, what is truth? And maybe nothing is true. And I think that's a dangerous place for people to be. I think, we have to be able to rely on on what are the facts of the matter, and then what is a plan that can help us. And I think storytelling and theater is a way to deal with those things.
Mm-hmm. We had a student last year. She wanted to do a theater honors presentation. And we had never done that before. Nobody had ever done. The honors program has been around at the college for a long time, but no one had ever wanted to do one in theater. So Dave picked out a monologue from Henri's Antigone for her.
Yeah.
And then we talked a lot about why he wrote the play, well, basing it, of course, on the Greek Antigone, but that was just fascinating. And it was also fascinating that the point of the story sort of went over the Nazis' head. They thought he was affirming their point of view when in fact he was really not affirming their point of view.
Yeah.
And it was like, how could they not see that? Oh, she did such a fabulous job on I cried when she did it. And I hope we have other students who want to do that because I think she blew everybody away when she did her monologue. He chose the monologue of the chorus, not Antigone, which it was just such a great, great monologue. So, well, we've been talking for a little while, and I wanted you to tell again about, I wanted to go back to you telling about your novel because it sounded really interesting, and I'm working on my second one, and sometimes hearing what other artists and authors are working on, it helps me get inspiration. So tell us about your novel.
Certainly. Yeah, I'm early into the first draft, about 20,000 words or about 100 pages. Hopefully, we'll churn out somewhere between 600 and 800 pages before we go to the second draft and rewrite and pare down. And I'm a firm believer in write a fast, lousy first draft, and then do the work beyond that. But the project that I'm working on, the novel, I've got a play in the works too. Usually I have at least one of those going on. But the novel is called Birthright. It's set in about 400 years in the future after something that is not well understood happened, something apocalyptic where 99% of the human race disappeared in what's called the runaway. And what happened during the runaway was that something, nobody is sure exactly what, unleashed into humanity a connectedness that connected them all to a great repository of human knowledge. The way I explain it is think of the Library of Alexandria, but it's updated and it contains all of human knowledge, every bit of human knowledge. And there's a team of librarians there that you can ask about anything, and that information is delivered to you. But even more so, for any question or statement that you make or even think, there's a pesky librarian right behind you, taps you on the shoulder and says, well, that turns out not to be the case, and then presents you with the evidence. So essentially, if you are faced with, you can't lie to yourself, you can't make up things because you are held up to this mirror of the soul that shows you everything you are and all you've done and everything you've thought or believed and what is true. And, when I think about that, I think most people, myself included, would not be able to tolerate that happening all at once.
That's right.
I mean, to be shown, just imagine standing before that great mirror and shown yourself, as they say, warts and all, but I mean, every bit of yourself in full honesty. It's intolerable. But, my story is set 400 years in the future, and the remnants of humanity are living in what appears to be a paradise. But is it a paradise? And are you still human if you can't lie? And people can't lie to you because you're presented with the truth. And are you still human if there is nothing but, utterly what's in front of you? And can you still tell stories? Can there still be fiction? And what if somebody decided that they didn't want the world that way? They wanted it back the way it was. So I'm kind of working through, some of those things as I work through the story. And, it takes place in three components. The first one's called home. The second one is called the road. because there's a journey. And then the third one is called The City. So it's 3 parts of the novel.
Oh.
So I'll have to get after it and get my lousy first draft.
My conversation with Randy continued on, but I know your time is precious. So I cut the episode here, and you'll have to tune in next week to finish listening to our conversation about story. As Randy says in the second half of this episode, you can never talk too much about stories. If you liked what you heard, please share it with a friend and give us a review on your favorite podcast app. It will help people find us. You'll find the show notes for this episode at my website, Sage Woman Chronicles, at sagewoman.life. You can leave a comment there. And remember, as Philip Pullman said, after nourishment, shelter, and companionship, stories are the thing we need most in the world. Until next time, this is Lucinda Sage-Midgorden. Thanks for listening.